Broadcasting around the world, this is On the Record with Christian Briggs. Serious talk about what's happening around the world and how it affects you. Unfiltered truth for a world on edge. Follow us on X at BMC_HAM. Live in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to On the Record. I'm Christian Briggs. Over the years, we've covered a wide range of subjects on this program. We've talked about the Federal Reserve, the national debt, inflation, the decline of purchasing power, central bank gold buying, the weaponization of the dollar, and the steady shift toward a more digital financial system. Some of those topics have sounded disconnected when viewed individually, but I've always argued that they're all part of the same story. If you understand how monetary systems evolve, you begin to see patterns that most people overlook because they're focused on whatever happened in the markets this week or what politicians are arguing about today. One subject that has repeatedly come up over the last several years is the central bank digital currency, or CBDC.
Now we have in Europe this threshold above 1,000 euros, you cannot pay cash. If you do, you are on the gray market. You take your risk. You get caught, you are fined, or you go in jail. But you know, the digital euro is going to have a limited amount of control. There will be control, you're right.
When I first began discussing digital currencies issued directly by central banks, most people had never heard the term. In fact, whenever I brought it up during interviews or client meetings, the reaction was usually the same. People assumed it was something decades away, or they believed governments would never attempt to fundamentally change the way money itself operates. The prevailing belief was that physical cash would always exist alongside electronic payments, and that consumers would simply have more options. The possibility that governments could eventually issue their own fully digital currency was viewed as an interesting academic exercise, not something that would become a serious public policy discussion. That has changed dramatically. Today, nearly every major central bank in the world is studying, testing, or actively developing some form of digital currency.
The digital euro is not just a means of payment, it is also a political statement concerning the sovereignty of Europe and its capacity to handle payment, including on a cross-border basis.
While we have seen slow but steady progress over the course of the last 2 years, there is now a growing urgency to reach political agreement and address remaining open issues.
What was once discussed inside academic papers and central banking conferences has become the subject of legislation, regulatory proposals, pilot programs, and international cooperation. The conversation is no longer about whether this technology is possible. It is about how quickly governments intend to implement it and what role it will ultimately play inside their financial systems. That distinction is incredibly important because it represents a shift from theory to execution. One of the reasons I've spent so much time discussing this topic is because monetary history teaches us that governments rarely make sweeping changes all at once. Financial systems usually evolve gradually. New regulations are introduced, payment technologies improve, banking rules change, and central banks slowly expand their capabilities over many years. Looking back decades later, those changes appear obvious. Living through them, however, they often seem incremental enough that very few people recognize how significant they are until the overall system looks completely different than it did before. I believe we're living through one of those periods right now. If you followed this program, you've heard me talk extensively about debt. The United States is carrying debt levels that would have been almost unimaginable a generation ago. We've discussed the long-term erosion of the dollar's purchasing power and how inflation affects far more than grocery bills or gasoline prices. We've examined why central banks around the world have been accumulating record amounts of physical gold, and we've talked about why countries are increasingly looking for alternatives to a financial system dominated by the US dollar. Those discussions were never isolated topics. They were individual pieces of a much larger picture that is becoming clearer with every passing year. Whenever governments face mounting debt obligations, slowing economic growth, banking instability, or persistent inflation, they begin searching for tools that provide greater flexibility in managing their financial systems. History provides countless examples of this. Sometimes those tools involve changes to interest rates. Sometimes they involve capital controls, banking reforms, currency redenominations, or entirely new monetary frameworks. The methods vary depending on the circumstances, but the underlying objective is remarkably consistent. Governments seek greater control over the mechanisms through which money moves throughout the economy because those mechanisms become increasingly important during periods of financial stress. That brings us to central bank digital currencies. Supporters of CBDCs point to several legitimate potential benefits. They argue that digital currencies could reduce payment costs, improve settlement speed, make cross-border transactions more efficient, combat certain forms of financial crime, and provide secure digital payment infrastructure as economies continue moving away from cash. Those arguments deserve to be part of the conversation because technology has always improved aspects of commerce. The concern isn't that technology exists. The concern is understanding what additional powers become available once money itself becomes fully digital and is issued directly by a central bank. Those are two very different discussions. For centuries, money has represented more than a medium of exchange. It represents accumulated labor, purchasing power, savings, investment, and economic freedom. Every paycheck, every retirement account, every business transaction, and every family budget ultimately depends on confidence that the monetary system will continue functioning in a predictable manner. When governments begin redesigning that system, citizens should understand not only what is changing, but also why those changes are taking place. That is precisely why today's developments deserve attention. Over the past several weeks, Europe has taken another meaningful step toward advancing the digital euro. At roughly the same time, new regulatory frameworks governing privately issued digital assets have continued taking effect across the European Union. Individually, those headlines might appear technical enough to ignore. Collectively, however, they suggest something much more significant. They suggest that policymakers are beginning to build the infrastructure for the next generation of money while simultaneously establishing the rules governing which competing forms of digital money will be permitted to operate alongside it. If that sounds familiar, it should. For years, I've said that governments don't simply introduce new monetary systems overnight. They build the legal framework first, they create the regulatory environment, they test the technology, they educate the public, they normalize the terminology. Eventually, the conversation shifts away from whether the system should exist and becomes focused on how citizens will interact with it. By the time most people realize the transition is well underway, many of the foundational decisions have already been made. That is why I believe today's news is so important. This isn't about predicting that a digital euro will immediately replace every existing form of money. It isn't about claiming that every concern surrounding central bank digital currencies has already become reality. Instead, it is about recognizing that the trajectory we've been discussing for years continues moving in the same direction. Every legislative proposal, every pilot program, every new regulatory framework provides another indication that governments around the world are investing enormous amounts of time and resources into building these systems. For me, that raises a broader question. Why? Why are so many central banks pursuing remarkably similar projects at roughly the same time? Why are governments placing such emphasis on digital monetary infrastructure after decades during which traditional banking systems functioned well enough for most consumers? Why has this become such a global priority despite countless other economic challenges competing for policymakers' attention? Those are the questions we'll examine throughout today's program. We'll look at what Europe has approved, why new regulations affecting digital assets matter far more than many people realize, and how all of this fits into the broader monetary trends we've been discussing for years. More importantly, we'll examine these developments through the lens of history, because history has a remarkable way of helping us understand where financial systems may be headed long before those changes become obvious to the general public. If you've listened to this program for any length of time, you know I've never believed that major monetary changes happen by accident. They are usually the result of years of planning, years of preparation, and years of policy decisions that gradually reshape the financial landscape. Looking at what's happening in Europe today, I believe we're witnessing another chapter in that long process. And I think it's a chapter everyone should understand because the decisions being made today could influence the way money functions for decades to come. When I first read the latest developments coming out of Europe, my immediate reaction wasn't surprise. It was confirmation. Over the last several years, we've watched the European Central Bank steadily move the digital euro from a research project into something far more tangible. There were investigation phases, consultation papers, technical working groups, pilot discussions, and legislative proposals. Each step was presented as another milestone in a careful process, and that's exactly how major monetary changes have always unfolded. Governments don't redesign financial systems in a single announcement. They build them one layer at a time until eventually the infrastructure is largely complete and the public begins asking not whether the new system is coming, but when they'll begin using it. That is why I believe the recent vote in the European Parliament deserves much more attention than it has received in the United States.
Where are we on the digital euro? Hopefully, by the end of the day tomorrow, we will know a lot better where we are, and I hope we are in a good place in order to start the next stage of the work, which is going to be of a more technical nature in order to run the pilot function that we need to have in place in order to really make sure that the experience of all our compatriots in Europe is a good experience, because I don't think we have the chance to, you don't get a second chance to make a good impression. It has to be a good experience for all of them. And I very much look forward to that phase.
Most Americans never heard about it. It certainly wasn't leading the evening news. Yet from a monetary standpoint, it may prove to be one of the more important developments of the year because it demonstrates that Europe continues moving toward a retail central bank digital currency despite growing political debate elsewhere in the world. While the United States has seen increasing opposition from policymakers who worry about the implications of a government-issued digital dollar, Europe has continued advancing its own project as part of what it describes as strengthening monetary sovereignty and modernizing the payments system.
ECB's independence is essential for us to deliver on our mandate of price stability. At a time when central bank independence is being challenged in parts of the world, your clear support sends an important signal to us.
Now, I want to be very careful with the language I use here because facts matter. The digital euro has not replaced the euro. Cash has not disappeared. Europeans did not wake up one morning to discover that every transaction had suddenly become programmable. That isn't what happened, and it isn't what I'm suggesting. What happened is something much more subtle, but in many ways more significant. Policymakers continued moving the project through the legislative process, signaling that they view a central bank digital currency not as a temporary experiment, but as an important component of Europe's long-term financial architecture. That distinction is critical because once governments invest years designing infrastructure, writing regulations, coordinating financial institutions, and preparing technology, those projects tend to develop their own momentum. One of the arguments European officials have consistently made is that the digital euro is necessary to preserve Europe's monetary independence. They point out that much of the continent's digital payment infrastructure relies on foreign companies and foreign payment networks. They also argue that privately issued stablecoins, many of which are linked to the US dollar, could gradually weaken the euro's role in the digital economy if Europe fails to provide its own public alternative. From their perspective, the digital euro isn't simply another payment application. It is a strategic asset intended to ensure that the European Central Bank remains at the center of the continent's monetary system as commerce becomes increasingly digital. Whether you agree with that reasoning or not, it tells us something important about how governments are thinking. This isn't being framed merely as a technology upgrade. It is being discussed in terms of national security, economic sovereignty, and geopolitical competition. Those are not words policymakers use when they're talking about a routine software update. They are the kinds of arguments governments make when they believe they are building infrastructure that will shape economic policy for decades. If you've followed central banking over the years, you'll recognize that this language has become increasingly common. We hear discussions about resilience, strategic autonomy, financial stability, payment sovereignty, and reducing dependence on foreign systems. Each of those phrases sounds reasonable when considered individually. Together, however, they reveal a much broader objective. Governments increasingly view payment systems as critical national infrastructure in the same way they view energy grids, telecommunications networks, transportation systems, or cybersecurity. That represents a meaningful shift in philosophy. Historically, central banks have focused primarily on issuing currency, managing interest rates, supervising financial stability, and acting as lenders of last resort during banking crises. A retail central bank digital currency expands that role into the daily payment lives of ordinary citizens in ways previous generations never experienced. Even if commercial banks continue providing customer-facing services, the underlying monetary infrastructure becomes increasingly connected to the central bank itself. Again, none of this necessarily proves malicious intent. Governments often pursue new capabilities because they believe those capabilities will help them respond more effectively during future crises. If another financial panic occurs, if payment networks fail, if cyber attacks disrupt banking systems, or if cross border payment competition intensifies, policymakers naturally want additional tools available. From a policymaker's perspective, that logic is understandable. The question I encourage people to ask is a different one. Whenever governments acquire powerful new capabilities during one period of history, how are those capabilities used 20 years later under completely different political leadership? History teaches us that institutions rarely surrender authority once it has been established. Powers introduced for one purpose frequently become available for entirely different purposes years later. That's true regardless of which political party happens to be in office because institutions generally outlive individual administrations. Central banks, legislatures, regulators, and bureaucracies continue operating long after presidents, prime ministers, or members of parliament leave office. That is why I always encourage people to think beyond today's headlines. The discussion shouldn't begin with whether you trust the current government. It should begin with whether you're comfortable creating systems that every future government will inherit. That's a much more difficult question. Throughout history, financial crises have often accelerated institutional change. Banking reforms introduced during emergencies sometimes become permanent. Temporary programs have a habit of lasting much longer than originally advertised. New reporting requirements, compliance standards, and regulatory authorities often expand gradually over time because each successive crisis creates another justification for keeping them in place. When I look at the digital euro through that historical lens, I don't simply see a new payment technology. I see another step in the long evolution of modern monetary systems. And I think that's precisely why this story deserves our attention here in the United States. Some people assume what happens in Europe stays in Europe. History suggests otherwise. Financial innovations have a tendency to cross borders. Regulatory ideas migrate. Governments study one another's successes and failures. Central bankers meet constantly through international organizations, conferences, and working groups. They exchange research, coordinate policy discussions, and observe how new financial technologies perform in real world environments. Whether or not the United States ultimately adopts its own central bank digital currency, American policymakers will undoubtedly study Europe's experience very closely because Europe is effectively conducting one of the largest monetary experiments of the modern era. That brings us to something else I find particularly interesting. For years, critics of central bank digital currencies were often dismissed as people worrying about hypothetical technology that might never exist. Today, the discussion has changed considerably. We are no longer debating whether central banks have the technical ability to build digital currencies. They clearly do. The debate has shifted toward design choices, privacy protections, legislative safeguards, holding limits, offline functionality, and governance structures. Those are the kinds of conversations that occur after policymakers have already decided the technology itself is worth pursuing. That is a very different stage of the conversation than we were having just a few years ago. Which brings us to the next question. If governments are investing enormous political capital into building official digital currencies, what happens to privately issued forms of digital money that compete with them? Because that story is unfolding at exactly the same time, and I don't believe the timing is accidental. Whenever governments introduce a new monetary system, there is always another question that receives far less attention than the technology itself. That question is remarkably simple. What happens to the alternatives? History suggests that every new monetary framework eventually defines not only what is permitted, but also what is discouraged. Sometimes that occurs through legislation. Sometimes it happens through taxation. Sometimes it comes through regulation, licensing requirements, or compliance rules that gradually make competing systems less practical. Regardless of the method, governments have historically sought to establish confidence in the official system while limiting anything they believe could undermine it. That is why another recent development in Europe deserves just as much attention as the digital euro itself. While lawmakers have continued advancing the framework surrounding a central bank digital currency, Europe has also implemented the Markets in Crypto Assets Regulation, better known as MICA. On the surface, MICA appears to be exactly what its supporters describe, a comprehensive regulatory framework designed to create consistent rules for digital assets across the European Union. Anyone who has followed cryptocurrency over the last decade knows the industry has often resembled the Wild West. Exchanges have collapsed. Investors have lost billions through fraud, hacks, and poor governance. Stablecoin issuers have operated under vastly different standards depending on where they were located. Reasonable regulation, transparency, and consumer protection are legitimate objectives, and I don't think anyone would argue otherwise. But regulation doesn't exist in a vacuum. Every regulatory framework also shapes competition. That becomes especially important when governments are simultaneously building their own digital monetary infrastructure. One of the consequences of MICA has been increased scrutiny surrounding stablecoins that fail to satisfy the European Union's new compliance requirements. Among the most widely discussed examples has been Tether, commonly known as USDT. For years, USDT has served as one of the primary sources of liquidity throughout the global cryptocurrency market. Traders use it to move between exchanges, settle transactions, preserve dollar exposure, and transfer value across borders without relying on traditional banking hours. Whether someone supports cryptocurrencies or not, there is no denying that USDT has become one of the largest digital dollar proxies in the world. Under Europe's evolving regulatory framework, however, the environment has changed considerably. Several exchanges operating within the European Union have reduced or eliminated support for USDT in response to MICA's requirements, choosing instead to focus on digital assets that align with the new regulatory standards. The practical result is that one of the world's most widely used stablecoins now faces meaningful limitations within a market representing hundreds of millions of consumers. Again, I want to be precise about what I'm saying. This is not a worldwide ban on USDT. People continue using it throughout much of the global economy. What has changed is its regulatory treatment inside the European Union. And that distinction matters because it demonstrates something we've seen repeatedly throughout financial history. Governments don't necessarily eliminate competing systems overnight. More often, they establish rules that make certain competitors more difficult to use while creating incentives for alternatives that better align with official policy. Whether that outcome is intentional or simply the natural consequence of regulation is something reasonable people can debate. What cannot be debated is that regulation influences behavior. Banks adjust their policies. Financial institutions alter their risk calculations. Exchanges modify their listings. Businesses change the products they offer. Consumers gradually adapt to whatever options remain most accessible. That process occurs so gradually that many people barely notice it until the market itself has fundamentally changed. When I look at these developments together, I don't see two unrelated stories. I see governments pursuing parallel objectives. On one track, policymakers are developing official digital currencies under the supervision of central banks. On another track, they're establishing comprehensive rules governing privately issued digital assets that could compete within the same ecosystem. From a policy perspective, that approach is perfectly logical. If governments intend to introduce a new form of sovereign digital money, they naturally want a regulatory environment that is orderly, predictable, and consistent with their broader monetary objectives. The question citizens should ask is whether that regulatory environment ultimately preserves meaningful competition. Competition has always been one of the healthiest forces in any economy. It encourages innovation, it creates accountability, it gives consumers alternatives when one provider fails to meet their needs. Financial systems are no different. Throughout history, the existence of competing institutions has often limited the concentration of economic power because consumers retained the ability to choose where they banked, how they invested, and in many cases, which assets they trusted to preserve wealth. As digital finance evolves, that principle becomes even more important. Imagine a future where nearly every financial transaction occurs electronically. Wages arrive digitally, bills are paid digitally, investments are managed digitally, taxes are collected digitally. Savings exist primarily as electronic entries rather than physical currency stored outside the banking system. If that future continues unfolding, as many policymakers openly expect it will, the structure governing those digital transactions becomes one of the most important public policy questions of the 21st century. That conversation extends well beyond cryptocurrency enthusiasts. This isn't really about Bitcoin. It isn't really about Tether. It isn't even primarily about blockchain technology. It's about who establishes the rules governing money itself. For generations, most people never had to think about that question because the financial system evolved slowly enough that change was barely noticeable. Today, technological innovation is moving at an entirely different pace. Artificial intelligence is transforming industries almost monthly. Payment systems continue becoming faster. Cross border settlement is improving. Digital identity technologies are advancing. Financial surveillance tools are becoming increasingly sophisticated. Each of these developments offers potential benefits, but together they also create capabilities that previous generations simply never possessed. That is why I believe this discussion should concern everyone, regardless of political affiliation. A Democrat should ask these questions. A Republican should ask these questions. An independent should ask these questions because monetary infrastructure outlives elections.
On the Record with Christian Briggs will be right back after a word from our sponsor. Gold has more than tripled since September 2022, rising from $1,656 per ounce to over $5,000 by February 2026. That's a 205% gain, outperforming the market, and proving why gold is the ultimate long-term hedge. As global debt soars and currencies weaken, central banks are hoarding gold at record pace. Why aren't you? Call 844-426-4653 or visit bmcham.com. Protect your future with real assets. Own gold now.
The rules established today may still be governing financial life 20 or 30 years from now. under leaders we haven't even met yet. I've often told clients that whenever I evaluate a monetary policy, I try to remove today's personalities from the equation. Instead of asking whether I trust the current administration, I ask whether I would be comfortable giving the same authority to every future administration. History teaches us that governments change, political priorities change, economic conditions change, and crises inevitably emerge that no one anticipated when new powers were originally created. That perspective has shaped my thinking for years. It is also one of the reasons I've consistently warned people not to dismiss central bank digital currencies as merely another technological innovation. Technology changes tools, monetary systems change incentives. When those two forces begin evolving together, the consequences can extend far beyond convenience or payment efficiency. As I look at Europe today, I see policymakers laying important pieces of a new financial architecture into place. I don't believe they're acting randomly. I believe they're responding to enormous economic pressures that include debt, geopolitical competition, digital commerce, cybersecurity concerns, and the desire to maintain monetary sovereignty in an increasingly fragmented world. Those are real challenges. But history also reminds us that major structural changes often produce consequences that aren't fully understood until years later. Which brings us to the question that concerns me most. What happens when governments no longer view digital money simply as a faster way to make payments, but as a tool capable of carrying public policy directly into every financial transaction? Because once money becomes programmable, entirely new possibilities begin to emerge, and those possibilities deserve a careful discussion before they become everyday reality. One of the questions I've been asked more than almost any other over the past 15 years is whether I believe there will eventually be a monetary reset. Sometimes people phrase it differently. They'll ask whether the dollar is going to collapse, whether we'll wake up to a new currency, or whether inflation will simply continue until the system breaks under its own weight. Regardless of how the question is asked, what people are really trying to understand is whether there comes a point in history when governments conclude that the existing monetary system can no longer continue in its current form. That question has fascinated economists for generations because monetary resets are not new. They're not uniquely American, nor are they unique to the modern era. Countries throughout history have restructured currencies, redenominated banknotes, introduced new monetary systems, and fundamentally changed the relationship between citizens and their money. Every nation arrives there differently. Some experience hyperinflation.
This cup of coffee, in a way, encapsulates the drama of the Venezuelan crisis. Today, you need this amount of money to buy this cup of coffee. But the inflation has been so out of control in Venezuela in recent years that today, this is the equivalent of what I had to pay 15 years ago for a one-bedroom flat.
Others suffer banking crises. Others confront overwhelming debt burdens or prolonged economic stagnation. The causes differ, but the underlying objective is remarkably similar. Governments reach a point where they believe the existing system no longer serves the needs of the economy they are trying to manage. Over the years, I've spent a considerable amount of time studying those transitions. I've looked at what happened in Mexico, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, parts of Eastern Europe, and numerous other countries that were forced to redesign their monetary systems under difficult economic circumstances. One of the lessons that continues to stand out is that the public almost never sees the transition coming in the way they imagine. Most people expect a dramatic announcement that changes everything overnight. History usually tells a different story. By the time the official announcement arrives, the underlying transition has often been underway for years. Governments have already changed regulations, financial institutions have already adapted their systems, and policymakers have already spent enormous amounts of time preparing the legal and technological framework necessary to support whatever comes next. The announcement simply makes public what has been developing behind the scenes. That perspective is one of the reasons I find today's discussion about central bank digital currencies so important. I'm not suggesting that Europe's digital euro automatically means a currency reset is imminent, Nor am I believe that every nation introducing digital payment infrastructure is secretly preparing to replace its existing currency tomorrow morning. Those are conclusions that simply go beyond the available evidence. What I am suggesting is that governments around the world are building tools that would make future monetary transitions significantly easier to administer if circumstances ever required them. Think about the difference between trying to restructure an economy built primarily around physical cash and paper records versus one built around fully digital financial infrastructure. In the first system, governments would need to replace physical currency, coordinate commercial banks, update payment networks, educate the public, and physically distribute new money across an entire country. It would be an extraordinarily complicated undertaking. A digital monetary system presents a very different set of possibilities. Balances can be updated electronically. Financial institutions can coordinate changes almost instantly. Payment infrastructure already exists. Consumers are accustomed to managing much of their financial lives through mobile devices and online banking. From a purely administrative standpoint, the mechanics of implementing significant monetary changes become considerably more efficient. Whether that capability is ever used is, of course, another question, but capabilities matter. History consistently demonstrates that governments tend to use the tools available to them during periods of crisis. Central banks lower interest rates because they possess that authority. Legislatures authorize emergency spending because those mechanisms already exist. Banking regulators intervene when financial institutions become unstable because legal frameworks have been established long before crises occur. Institutions cannot exercise powers they do not possess, which is precisely why they spend years building those powers before they believe they'll need them. That is why I think many people misunderstand the significance of CBDCs. They often evaluate them solely as payment technology. I evaluate them as monetary infrastructure. Infrastructure isn't exciting while it's being built. People don't pay much attention to bridges until they need to cross a river. They don't think about electrical grids until the lights go out. They don't study water systems until something disrupts access to clean drinking water. Monetary infrastructure works the same way. Most people never think about it because, under normal circumstances, it simply operates in the background. Yet it quietly determines how every paycheck is received, how every mortgage is paid, how businesses settle transactions, and how governments move trillions of dollars through the economy every year. Changing that infrastructure changes far more than payment speed. It changes the capabilities available to policymakers. One of the reasons I've continued warning audiences about this subject is because we've already witnessed how rapidly governments can alter financial policy when they believe circumstances require extraordinary action. During financial crises, we've seen emergency lending programs, unprecedented monetary expansion, quantitative easing, historically low interest rates, banking interventions, and enormous fiscal spending packages introduced in remarkably short periods of time. Whether one believes those actions were justified isn't really the point. The point is that governments move much faster during emergencies than they do during periods of stability. Now, imagine that same environment 20 years from now if central bank digital currencies have become deeply integrated into the financial system. Imagine policymakers confronting another severe banking crisis, another sovereign debt crisis, another pandemic, or another geopolitical conflict that threatens financial stability. Would governments be more likely to ignore new monetary capabilities they spent decades developing, or would they naturally look toward those capabilities as part of their response? History gives us a fairly consistent answer. Governments use the tools they have.
So you have the HEROES Act, which proposes a $1,200 payment for individuals, $2,400 for families, and another $1,200 payment for dependents. So that raises that amount from $500 in the CARES Act up to $1,200.
That observation isn't cynical, it's historical. Whenever I speak with clients, I often remind them that governments generally don't wake up looking for ways to make life more difficult for their citizens. Policymakers usually believe they're acting in the public interest. They believe they're solving problems. They believe they're preserving stability. Most major policy decisions begin with legitimate concerns about economic growth, unemployment, inflation, banking stability, or national security. The challenge is that solutions created for one generation often become inherited powers for the next. That is why institutional design matters so much. A financial system should never be evaluated solely by asking whether today's leaders would use it responsibly. It should also be evaluated by asking whether the same powers would remain appropriate under every future administration, during every future crisis, and under economic conditions we cannot yet imagine. That question becomes even more important when money itself becomes programmable. We've already discussed how digital currencies create opportunities for faster payments and more efficient settlement. Those are meaningful advantages. But programmable money also introduces entirely new policy possibilities that simply do not exist with physical cash. The technology can theoretically allow monetary rules to be embedded directly into the currency itself, depending on how governments choose to design it. That possibility has generated considerable debate among economists, privacy advocates, central bankers, and technology experts because it fundamentally changes what money is capable of doing. Some governments have emphasized that privacy protections will remain central to their designs. Others have discussed spending limits, holding limits, and mechanisms intended to preserve financial stability. Those discussions are important because they demonstrate that the architecture of these systems is still evolving. But regardless of where those debates ultimately end, I believe citizens should pay close attention while those decisions are still being made rather than after the infrastructure has already become part of everyday life. History has a way of reminding us that the most consequential decisions are often made long before the public fully appreciates their significance. And that's exactly why the next part of this conversation may be the most important of all. Because once governments possess the ability to issue digital money directly, the discussion naturally expands beyond economics and into something much broader. It becomes a discussion about the relationship between financial freedom, individual privacy, and the role governments should play in the everyday economic lives of their citizens. That's where this story becomes much bigger than Europe. It's where it becomes a conversation about the future of money itself. One of the reasons this conversation has become so polarized is that people often approach it from opposite directions. There are those who believe central bank digital currencies represent the inevitable modernization of money, and that resisting them is no different than resisting online banking or credit cards decades ago.
The key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also, we will have the technology to enforce that.
On the other side are people who believe the mere existence of a CBDC guarantees the end of financial freedom. As is often the case, reality is more complicated than either extreme. Technology itself is neither good nor bad. The question has always been how that technology is used, who controls it, what safeguards exist, and whether those safeguards can withstand changing political and economic circumstances over long periods of time. History provides plenty of examples of innovations that produce tremendous benefits while simultaneously creating entirely new risks. The internet connected billions of people and transformed global commerce, but it also created cybersecurity threats, identity theft, misinformation campaigns, and unprecedented data collection. Artificial intelligence is already improving productivity across countless industries, while at the same time forcing governments and businesses to wrestle with questions that barely existed 5 years ago. Every major technological advancement expands opportunity, but it also expands capability, and capability is something governments have always paid close attention to. That is why I believe the discussion surrounding CBDCs should never begin with asking whether today's policymakers have good intentions. Instead, it should begin with understanding the incentives that governments face.
central bank digital currencies. We understand that for CBDCs, the biggest question is interoperability. How are they going to connect to each other? It offers us all faster service, much lower cost, and more inclusion.
Every government, regardless of ideology or geography, wants a stable financial system. It wants to reduce tax evasion. It wants to combat organized crime, terrorist financing, large-scale fraud, sanctions evasion, and cybercrime. Those are legitimate responsibilities. Citizens expect governments to maintain the integrity of the financial system, and most people would agree that those objectives are appropriate. The challenge is that once governments possess more powerful financial tools, the range of situations in which those tools might be used inevitably expands. We've watched that happen repeatedly throughout history. Authorities created for extraordinary situations frequently become normalized over time. Emergency powers enacted during financial crises are sometimes extended long after the crisis has passed. Temporary surveillance authorities occasionally become permanent features of government. Regulatory agencies often receive additional responsibilities that were never envisioned when those agencies were originally established. None of that necessarily happens because of malicious intent. More often, it happens because each new challenge creates another argument for expanding an existing system rather than building an entirely new one. Financial infrastructure is no exception. Imagine you're a policymaker facing a severe recession. Consumer spending has slowed dramatically. Businesses are failing. Unemployment is rising. Under today's monetary system, central banks primarily influence the economy indirectly through interest rates, banking reserves, and broader financial conditions. Those tools affect the economy, but they do so gradually and often unpredictably. Now, imagine a future where a central bank possesses a digital monetary infrastructure capable of reaching consumers much more directly. From the perspective of policymakers, that capability could appear enormously attractive during a crisis. Economists have debated hypothetical examples for years. Could emergency stimulus payments be distributed more quickly? Could disaster relief reach affected communities within hours rather than weeks? Could governments respond faster during banking disruptions? Those are serious policy questions, and they help explain why so many central banks have invested considerable resources into researching digital currencies. But every capability introduces additional questions. If money can be distributed more quickly, could conditions also become more sophisticated? If governments possess the ability to build rules into digital monetary systems, where should those boundaries be drawn? How much authority should central banks possess? What role should legislatures play? What legal protections should citizens expect? Who ultimately determines how these systems evolve over time? Those questions become even more important because financial technology rarely stands still. The digital euro being discussed today will not be identical to whatever version exists 10 or 15 years from now. Software evolves, security evolves, artificial intelligence evolves, payment systems evolve, financial regulation evolves. Anyone who has worked in technology understands that the first version of a platform rarely resembles the mature version that exists years later. As we bring today's discussion to a close, I want to leave you with a perspective that I think often gets lost whenever central bank digital currencies are debated. Too many people assume this conversation is about technology. I don't believe it is. Technology is simply the vehicle. The real discussion is about the future relationship between citizens, governments, and money itself. Throughout history, every major change in the monetary system has eventually altered that relationship in some way. Sometimes those changes produced greater prosperity. Sometimes they produced greater stability. Sometimes they solved one problem while creating several new ones. That is why monetary history is so valuable. It reminds us that no financial system is static, and it reminds us that every generation eventually inherits decisions made by the one before it. I think that's exactly where we find ourselves today. When I first began talking publicly about central bank digital currencies, Years ago, many people dismissed the topic because it seemed too futuristic. They couldn't imagine why governments would want to issue digital money directly through their central banks, and they certainly couldn't imagine lawmakers devoting years to designing the legal framework necessary to support it. At that time, most people were still trying to understand cryptocurrencies, blockchain technology, and whether Bitcoin itself would survive. The idea that governments would eventually become some of the most active participants in the digital currency conversation seemed almost contradictory. Yet here we are. Europe continues advancing the digital euro. China continues expanding the development of its digital yuan. Central banks across the world continue publishing research, conducting pilot programs, and studying how digital currencies might fit into their long-term monetary strategies. Whether every one of those projects ultimately succeeds isn't really the point. The point is that governments have clearly concluded that digital money will play an important role in the future of finance, and they intend to be part of building that future rather than simply reacting to it. That realization alone should encourage every citizen to become more informed. You don't have to oppose every technological innovation to ask thoughtful questions about it. You don't have to reject modernization to insist upon transparency. You don't have to assume malicious intent before asking what safeguards should exist. Those are not partisan questions. They are questions every free society should be asking whenever fundamental institutions begin changing. Throughout today's program, we've talked about Europe because Europe has become one of the clearest examples of how these transitions unfold. First comes years of research, then come technical working groups, then legislation, then regulatory frameworks governing competing forms of digital money. Eventually, the discussion shifts toward implementation, consumer adoption, and operational details. None of those individual developments appear revolutionary when viewed in isolation. It is only when you step back and examine the entire sequence that the broader trajectory becomes visible. That is one of the lessons I hope listeners take away from today's conversation. Major monetary changes rarely arrive all at once. They develop gradually enough that each individual step appears reasonable, even routine. By the time people recognize the cumulative effect of those decisions, the financial landscape has often changed substantially. We've seen this pattern before. When electronic banking first emerged, it existed alongside paper statements and passbooks. When online banking became available, many people continued writing checks because that was what they trusted. I'll continue monitoring gold purchases, reserve currencies, payment technologies, and geopolitical developments because I've learned that these stories rarely exist independently. More often than not, they're connected in ways that only become obvious with the benefit of time. Some of you have heard me talk about these issues for more than a decade. You've heard me discuss declining purchasing power, mounting sovereign debt, central bank gold accumulation, the growing interest in digital currencies, and the possibility that monetary systems would eventually undergo significant transformation. At times, those conversations probably sounded repetitive. Today, however, many of those same topics have moved from the margins into mainstream policy discussions. That doesn't mean every prediction will unfold exactly as anyone expects. History rarely follows a perfectly straight line, but history does reward those who pay attention to long-term trends rather than short-term headlines. As investors, that's our responsibility. As citizens, I believe it's also our responsibility. The future of money is not being written in some distant decade. It is being debated in legislatures, central banks, regulatory agencies, and international institutions right now. The choices made during this period will almost certainly influence the financial lives of our children and grandchildren in ways we cannot yet fully appreciate. That is why I believe awareness is one of the most valuable assets any investor can possess. Stay informed, study history, ask difficult questions. Understand not only what governments are building, but why they believe those systems are necessary in the first place. Because if history has taught us anything, it is that the most significant financial transformations are usually recognized only after they have already begun. Thank you for joining me for another edition of On the Record. I'm Christian Briggs, and as always, we'll continue watching these developments closely because this story is far from over.